And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Judith Ainsworth, who is the convener of the Canadian caucus for the 2022 to 2024 biennium. Judith joined Zonta in 2008 with the Zonta Club of Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. At this time, she was teaching French and business French at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo. She learned about Zonta's international projects, got to know some of the dedicated, inspiring, and fun women, and knew that's right where she wanted to be. Judith has led committees at our clubs and district levels in advocacy, the United Nations, and the Jane M. Klausman Women of Business Scholarship, and developed many presentations on these topics. In August of 2021, she was appointed to the District 2 delegate to the newly formed Canada Caucus and is now the Canada Caucus convener for this biennium. Judith holds a PhD in education, specializing in applied linguistics from the University of Montreal. She currently teaches business and professional communications at McGill University. For the past 3 years, she has taught written and oral communication courses aligned with Ashia University in Accra, Ghana. While analyzing text, her students get to hear about human rights, and many choose to present projects on practices in Africa that infringe on the rights of women to achieve their full potential. It's exciting that Zonta and the United Nations are inserted into the conversation, and Judith has connected with the Zonta clubs of Accra #2. Judith is very pleased to be part of the Zonta Says Now Intercontinental think tank, where she is learning so much about the effects of climate around the world. Thank you, Judith, and please, let's hear from you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. Great. Yeah, I'm just so enthusiastic about Zonta. I was doing a Zonta event yesterday, and this is why I've just sort of managed to get back to Montreal today. It was in Ottawa yesterday, or Kanata, my new club, but yeah, and so I'm back in Montreal right now. But yeah, so can I share my slides then? Is that right? Yeah, okay. Because boy, things are happening so fast right now in Canada with climate change that I just sort of keep updating and updating these slides all the time. So yeah, climate change and how it's affecting gender in Canada. So we had the map there, and I think Angela, you probably had a more updated. I'm looking at the census in 2021, but I know that the population is expected to go up to, I think you had 38 million, maybe 39 million. Yeah, you can see the size of Canada and you can see our population. And so you would wonder why so few people, such a large landscape, we have problem with climate change. 10 provinces, 3 territories. Okay, so I'm going to talk, my presentation is divided into about 4 parts here. So escalating climate change disasters, and I'm sure everybody's heard about the local one that's happening across Canada right now. A few words to say about that, but others too. The effects on our Indigenous communities and women, some problematic greenhouse gas reduction, the policies in Canada, and I've been to a couple of great presentations. The leader of the Green Party of Canada, and she gave a presentation while I was in Ottawa. It's fabulous. And then what's happening with decision-making in Canada. Okay, so the escalating climate change disasters. So I'm going to start on the West Coast, okay, the Pacific Coast here in British Columbia. So in 2021, we had this Western heat dome, the deadliest weather event in Canada to date. And as you can see, in 4 days, from the 25th of June to the 1st of July, Canada Day, our national holiday, 619 deaths. Temperature surpassed 40 degrees Celsius. For Canada, this, especially British Columbia, very temperate climate. Doesn't get that cold in the winter or that warm in the summer, but 40 degrees unheard of. 98% of the deaths occurred indoors. Most of them, as you can see, the 2/3 of them were age 70 and over, and half of them lived alone. So you can see that age, poor housing, poverty, all of this contributed to the deaths, and women do make up the greater part of this group. Oops, so now, what happened the same year in British Columbia was flooding. And so the level of flooding was unprecedented, destroyed bridges, highways were washed out, and the province of the southern and part of the province of British Columbia cut off every major route connecting the lower mainland to the rest of Canada. So people were stranded, livestock stranded, getting goods and around the province or to people to help out. It was a real disaster. Now, I put this in here too about this, also in British Columbia, there is this mountain pine beetle population, which is growing, spreading, and it started in British Columbia, as you can see on the map, and it has jumped the Rocky Mountains. It is now in Alberta, and it's, of course, it's devastating the pine forest, the boreal forest of north central Alberta, the boreal forests in Alberta now, which tend to have less, they're less dense and they're smaller trees, so really attacking it badly. And we're not too sure just where it's going to go next because, of course, we have pine forests from one side of the country to the other. And if it heads east, it's devastating. So as you can see, the historic range, but keep this in mind, this range here, I'm just showing you the two provinces, but the next slide, I'm showing you Canada. And here is a map. If you look at the very high, so the blue colors and the green, this is where carbon is sequestered underground. Here, okay, here, like, and across the Alberta, some Saskatchewan, Ontario and Quebec for sure, and the green there out in the eastern provinces. So Canada, yeah, boreal forests, what's the big deal? Well, Canada has 25% of the Earth's wetlands and boreal forests, and both of these naturally sequester carbon in their root systems, their organic root systems, and keeps it underground, doesn't let it get out into the atmosphere. So we have more, they store more than the Amazon forest does, and about 80% of that carbon is stored in these boreal soils. But with the logging, now these forest fires, just clear cutting, all of this carbon is released into the atmosphere. And so that's part of our carbon emissions, stuff that was normally sequestered. So of course, probably heard about this, 2023, Canada's worst wildfire season of the 21st century. So this is from the Emergency Preparedness Minister. We have someone else who said from the Northern Forestry Center, Department of Natural Resources, this many fires from coast to coast at this time of year is not normal. And I just want to give a shout out. We are so happy that we have had firefighters from South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the US, France, Portugal, Spain, Costa Rica, all of these firefighters who have come to Canada to help us because we certainly couldn't have done it on our own. So just how on fire is Canada? So a lot of things here, this I've just sort of put on this one slide. This is a real picture, by the way, from Alberta. Okay, 11 provinces and territories have been affected by thousands of fires, and they're out of control, trying to get these fires under control without any rain because there has not been any rain or very little rain. It's really, really, firefighters are just begging for rain. So we had the single largest wildfire in British Columbia, 108 forest fires in Alberta, and Alberta declared a state of emergency in the month of May. Then almost 40% of the fires are in Quebec. Been evacuating people. 34 wildfires in Newfoundland. Doesn't sound like much. The province is Newfoundland and Labrador, by the way. So 34, doesn't sound like much, but there were only 2 the previous year. So now we have 34 this year. The largest recorded forest fire in Nova Scotia history, 16,000 people were evacuated. And then this wall of smoke that came across from Quebec into Ontario and in Ottawa, and I was in Ottawa that day. and the smoke, but the smog, the pollution factor, just horrible. And it went into the United States as well. So the northern United States, the New England states were getting it all as well. So already this year, we've had 2,536 wildfires, almost 5 million hectares of land burned, more than what was burned in 2016, 19, 20, and 22 combined. I'm not sure if you know what the size of a hectare is. A hectare is about the size of a football field. I'm not sure if it's a Canadian or American football field, but Canadian, this is American football. The Canadian field is a bit bigger. But anyways, just to let you know about the air quality. So in Ottawa and Ontario, particularly Ottawa, the peak reading on that Wednesday morning when I was in Ottawa was 500, this is particles, okay, these particles in the air, okay, early Wednesday morning, went down to 72 Wednesday afternoon. Typical for Ottawa is under 10, and we hit 500 that morning. So this fine particulate matter has been linked to premature births, worsened lung disease among the young or the most vulnerable, increased risk of heart attacks, strokes among the elderly, respiratory, cardiovascular problems. So the hospitals are definitely on standby and worried that because some of this will happen later after it all gets ingested and gets into the bloodstream of patients. So just moving on, just to mention a few more provinces and what has been happening. So the grasslands out on the prairies, they're also in danger because they are being plowed up and planted. So as you can see here, almost 150,000 acres of grassland were converted to crops. The losses in the three provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, 25%. A lot of Indigenous communities, of course, live out here, and they try to recover, do things to recover, get rid of the invasive plant species and try to restore it. But they say it takes up to about 100 years for the soil to recover, and it may never, ever recover. And so, of course, we've lost 25 million acres. And at the moment, Alberta and Saskatchewan only protect in the laws 1% of what is remaining. So 99% can still be destroyed. But my question again is, what's the big deal about prairie grasslands? Well, it's one of the most endangered ecosystems on the planet. And I mentioned about the Indigenous communities, for example, the Kainai Nation citizens, they harvest medicinal plants, they hunt, they hold ceremonies. It's part of their whole culture and lifestyle. And like the boreal forests, these uncultivated grasslands store an estimated 2 to 3 billion tons of carbon in their root systems. So they stock this underground where it's not getting out into the atmosphere. But once we cultivate them, we dig them all up, we lose up to half of the stored carbon and we no longer have the benefits for the ecosystem. Now, I put this in just briefly, just to show that last winter and in the spring, we had snowstorms, ice storms, flooding. And this woman here, she's hopped into her canoe and she's gone off to get groceries for her neighbors who couldn't get out of their homes due to the flooding. This is on the Ottawa River, by the way. This was on the news. They showed her. So she's canoeing off to the stores to get some groceries and supplies for her neighbors. Now, on the East Coast, I read this in worlddata.info just last month. Hurricanes only occur occasionally in Canada, on average, about 4 times a year. Now, if you look at the past 4 years and you add that all up and you divide that by 4, well, it's more like 5 times a year that we get hurricanes. But anyways, last fall in September, Hurricane Fiona, it was the costliest and most intense post-tropical storm to hit Canada on record. All of these things are setting new records, unprecedented heat or snowstorms or whatever. It's these past couple of years have been pretty bad. So what are some of the effects now? So back over in British Columbia on the West Coast, of course, this is where There's an awful lot of salmon. The salmon comes in, they come in and they spawn. They're called the salmon peoples because this is their culture. They live by salmon. Their food, they depend on salmon, and their whole culture revolves around it. So when problems now are that the spawning rivers are too warm, low water flow, changing ocean currents and temperatures as well, reduced availability because the oceans are warming up, reduced amount of fish for them to feed on. And the picture that I have here, these salmon are all dead. They were trying to go back to the spawning grounds, so they go up the rivers, the salmon rivers, they go up the rivers, and they go up so far to where the spawning beds are, but once they got up there, there was no water. So they jumped into a dry area and they all died. Millions of them. So women are, of course, the main gatherers and preservers, planners, preparers of food in traditional societies. So what do they do? I mean, the whole society that lives on this, yeah, it's been a disaster for them. So up in the north now, our Yukon Territory, Northwest Territory, the Arctic, they've been experiencing much warmer temperatures as well. The annual temperature has risen 2 degrees Celsius over the past 50 years. The winters are warmer, as you can see. The sea ice is melting, the glaciers are melting, the permafrost is melting. More permafrost thawing as well, ghost fires, because with these forest fires, we might think they're out, but these fires can travel underground and just pop up somewhere else, and they're called ghost fires, and this is happening in the north. The Northwest Territories this year, on the 3rd of May, hit 31 degrees Celsius, breaking the previous record of 27.2 degrees in 1898. So it's never, ever been that hot up there. So, of course, the northern Indigenous populations experience food insecurity, but even the settler women and families who live up in the north too. Because if we, for the Indigenous people who hunt seals, the disappearing sea ice reduces the possibility. Okay, the seals are disappearing. Changing ocean currents impact the traditional fishing and whale hunting. And because we depend on our country getting cold and freezing, especially up north, and we can create roads. Okay, so these are roads that are built in the winter, ice roads. So they freeze late, they thaw early, and then how do we transport goods that they need? And this is a problem. So as I said, under the effects, first of all, increased cost of foods that have to be brought north. Settler women as well as Indigenous women are all affected by food insecurity and difficult overland transport of supplies. If we don't have ice roads, there's nothing. There is no other road. So the problematic greenhouse gas reduction policies, I have a couple of examples here because you can see the common policies here on the one side, and the study is advocating for these more effective policies. So subsidies for low carbon technologies, well, okay, but if we have mandatory regulations for carbon pricing, is much more effective. Another problem that has been studied in the past few years is that we have so many jurisdictions, federal, provincial, local jurisdictions, and they do not synchronize or coordinate their policies. So they're undermining each other. So we need to synchronize across all these levels. 74% of the policies help reduce additional emissions. Well, that's good, but what are we doing to reduce the current emission levels? We need policies to do that. And incentivizing electric vehicles, it's okay if we also decarbonize the electric grid, then we will create greater emissions reductions. So instead of just keeping the emission levels where they are, we can reduce them. So a couple of examples that I have here, this is in British Columbia. So electric vehicles under the federal emission standards, they will earn credits that exceed the actual emissions. So we have these extra credits. Now the provincial policy, of course, is zero emission vehicle sales mandate. They incentivize adopting electric vehicles. So people do, but then we have all these extra credits that will enable people to buy cars, regular, gasoline cars. So the regular vehicle fleet. So we still meet the standards, but in the end, there's a net increase in emissions. We haven't saved anything. Nova Scotia as well. So there's a federal carbon tax in Canada, but in Nova Scotia, they have this cap and trade. I was never able to figure out how cap and trade worked, and I still can't. But as you can see, if one industry emits less, like the cap is the dotted line across there. So if there's an industry that emits less, so it doesn't reach that, that's fine, that's great. But then they can trade it or sell it to another industry that can then go above that cap and emit more. And so in the end, we're just shifting costs and emissions between industries or between activities, and we're not reducing anything. So I've always wondered how this worked, and so far I still don't know how this is ever going to reduce our emissions. So now, problematic model for regulating and accounting for greenhouse gas emissions. This is from logging in the boreal forest. So instead of actually using the direct data, you would have data on this and how much is destroyed and the carbon going into the air. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has a rule where we'll just use modeling. So we'll just think about, well, here's a model. This is how it could be working without using the direct data. So it's inaccurate accounting, and it's very conservative assumptions of the amount of carbon stored in these soils. So the attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council wrote, well, unfortunately, while we may be able to creatively account for these things, the atmosphere does not recognize creative accounting. How true. Now, third, in Ontario, I haven't talked too much about Ontario, but the Auditor General has given the Tories, our Conservatives, a failing grade. So a lot of different things here. The one I wanted to mention, though, is this policy where companies can pay to literally destroy a habitat, okay, clear cut, dig up wetlands. There's another, I can't think of it at the moment, but anyways, or not dig up wetlands, but fill them in so wetlands are gone too. Anyways, then they pay, and this money goes into a fund, the Special Conservation Fund, and then the government will use this fund elsewhere to reestablish, to create another ecological system somewhere else. So it's been dubbed the Pay to Slay Fund. So companies, industry can pay to slay, to basically just get rid of a certain ecosystem area, and the government says, well, we'll rebuild it, we'll redo it somewhere else. And of course, another thing is that there's a law, there's the Environmental Bill of Rights, and the government is just ignoring it. As I said here, it's the public's right to be consulted, and the government is not asking the public to come to any hearings or any public get-togethers on these things. So we have an intergovernmental council, the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment. So the 10 provinces, the 3 territories, and the federal minister. Reason I have 2 pictures of women is they're the only 2 out of that 13. Only 2 women are on that Council of Ministers of the Environment. Now, of course, Alberta has no incentive to do anything because 25% of their GDP and 10% of governor revenue is attributed to the oil and gas sector. So they want to keep exploiting. I haven't even begun to talk about our oil sands. It's a disaster. Anyway, so they've only implemented about half the number of policies to try to reduce emissions. We're not working together, so we need greater coordination, is what I said. And then, of course, energizing this Council of the Ministers of the Environment. When I've gone onto their website, they're mostly talking about reducing plastic, or there's nothing on there about our greenhouse gas emissions, or nothing very substantial anyways that I've been able to find. They need to be, have some, definite mandate or be incentivized to do something. So one thing that's been talked about a lot is leveraging nature-based climate solutions. So nature-based climate solutions, which I've been talking about, are boreal forests, protecting them, protecting our grasslands, protecting peatlands. Peatlands, another that Canada has. We have the world's longest coastline. So we have all these oceans around us, all this water. So Canada being home to 25% of the Earth's wetlands and boreal forests, and then the others as well, we have lots of everything, huge country. We can play a vital role in the global fight, not just Canada's fight, but the global fight against climate change. And when I was talking about the previous one, the pay to slay, as the policy has been dubbed, it's much easier to protect a forest than recreate an entire forest. And an example given, built wetlands are 150% more expensive and worse at storing carbon than simply protecting a wetland. And of course, the Indigenous communities and a lot of other people are calling for, let's look at nature-based climate solutions. We don't need more technology. Technology hasn't helped us in the past 30 or 40 years. So let's do something else. And I'm just going to finish my really my last slide here with the SDGs. Number 13 is take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. But 15 is interesting too, because it's protect, restore, promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage the forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. So definitely what the Ontario government has planned is completely opposite. We will destroy first, and then we'll build back. And so just want to thank everyone for listening.